Joining me now is Senior Editor-at-Large at Newsweek, Josh Hammer. Josh, the New York Post is reporting former President Donald Trump has lashed out during his $250 million civil fraud trial in Manhattan, accusing the judge, Arthur Engoron, of fraud and labelling State Attorney Letitia James a hack. Well, yeah, that's true. Trump reportedly began his testimony calmly but lost his cool when the judge threatened to throw him out for making speeches on the stand. What more can you tell us about what's happened in the past few hours, Josh?
Yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts to unpack here, Rita. So first and foremost, perhaps most important, this is a ridiculous lawsuit. I mean, this is an utterly absurd. This is a civil lawsuit. This is not a criminal prosecution. They're essentially operating on a legal theory that maybe it's not even a gimmick. I mean, maybe using some numbers for purposes of appraisal of real estate instead of certain other numbers, which, by the way, happens essentially every time that anyone who owns any property has to pay taxes. You're going to go with the most favorable numbers. It's basically everyone who does this. This is ubiquitous in America. Yeah. This is not criminal conduct whatsoever. They're essentially saying that this is reason enough for the Trump organization to implode and shut down. It's utterly absurd, and it's doubly absurd, I think, when you think about the fact that Tish James herself, the Attorney General of New York State, who Donald Trump is correctly calling a hack, it's doubly absurd when you bear in mind that she, much like the Soros-backed prosecutor Alvin Bragg in Manhattan in New York City, they both ran on explicit platforms, Rita, telling people on the campaign trail that they were going to try to get Trump after they were elected. You know, if that is not the most un-American thing imaginable, I mean, our Constitution explicitly says that there shall be no laws singling out any individuals. Kind of the same thing here. I mean, yes, it's campaign rhetoric, so it's technically legally saying it's basically the same concept here. Very un-American stuff. You know, here's what I will say on the other side of the equation, though, Rita. You know, if I were one of Donald Trump's lawyers, I would try to encourage him to just deal with this. I mean, it's going to get dismissed, probably not at the trial level because this judge is very biased, but at an appeal level, you know, the New York State appellate courts tend to be a little more legally serious here. So I would encourage him to, you know, just try to answer the questions. I know this is a fraud. This is ridiculous. It's a whole stunt, but just try to get it over with, and then we can move on to the actual election.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think people need to know that these are politically motivated persecutions, you could call them. And if you've got not just activist DAs, but activist judges, then the entire justice system is called into question. No wonder faith in the justice system has plummeted in the US, and it's cases like this that are just going to highlight the problems there. So now I'm not sure I agree that he should just behave himself and not call this woman a hack when she is one. He's facing more than 90 indictments, and we're officially 1 year away from the presidential election. And despite all this, or maybe partly because of it, the latest polls show Donald Trump charging ahead of Joe Biden in several key seats, what is shaping up to be a repeat of the 2020 showdown. The latest New York Times Siena College poll is found that Joe Biden not only trails Donald Trump nationally, and also amongst independents by quite a big margin amongst independents. But Biden is now losing to Trump in 5 of the 6 battleground states. And as the New York Times notes, in a remarkable sign of a gradual racial realignment between the two parties, the more diverse the swing state, the further Mr. Biden was behind. And he led only in the whitest of the 6. That's quite a turn up for the books, isn't it, Josh? We've been told for years that not only is Donald Trump unelectable, but minorities hate him.
You know, it's funny, Rita, if you look at the broader realignment that has been happening in American politics, really kind of picking up in earnest in the 2016 election, The Democratic Party was used to operating for a solid 15 to 20-year period there from kind of the Bill Clinton presidency, certainly kind of reaching its apex during the Barack Obama presidency. They were used to operating where their coalition was essentially a coalition of the aggrieved. It was kind of an intersectional identity politics interest group coalition, with the exception of perhaps some overeducated, New York City, Upper West Side, New York Times reading liberal white PhDs. But with the exception of that, it was very much trying to kind of pick up a very high percentage of the black vote, very high percentage of the Hispanic vote, very high percentage of the illegal alien vote, to the extent illegal aliens are voting, which they obviously should not be doing there. So anytime that you see one of these intersectional entities, these subgroups that are peeling away from the Democrats toward the Republicans, that is cause for absolutely massive concern for the Democratic Party. Black voters have been slowly, especially young black males under the age of 40. I think the percentage of those voters that Trump got in 2020 was over 20%, possibly as high as nearly 25% or so. Hispanic voters, based on all data that we've seen recently, look like they're going to be going even more towards Republicans now than they have been in the past. The most interesting thing that's happened within the kind of intersectional kind of coalition management, Rita, is the Muslim American vote, because the Muslim American vote has actually been souring quite a bit on Joe Biden over the past month or so. Because at least at the beginning of the war in the Middle East, he was very rhetorically supportive of Israel. He's starting to pare that back a little bit because there's a large Arab population in Michigan in particular, and he can't afford to lose Michigan. But all of this combined amounts to something closely approximating a 5-alarm fire for the Democratic Party, which is why you've seen David Axelrod, Barack Obama's chief advisor this weekend. You saw Joe Biden's own 2020 campaign manager starting to sound the alarm. I personally, Rita, think that Democrats are stuck with Joe Biden, whether they want to be stuck with him or not, because I don't think that you're going to be able to just sweet talk him into not running for re-election. Bear in mind, recall, this is someone who has wanted to be president for 50 years. He got to D.C. as a senator in the early 1970s. Yeah. He first ran for president in 1988. He finally has it, and now what? You're going to tell him to not run for re-election? Of course, if he steps aside, then their presumptive choice, naturally, would be the vice president, Kamala Harris. The problem with Kamala Harris is that she's less popular than venereal disease. She is wildly unpopular. She is grossly incompetent. Her office leaks like a sieve. I think a lot of Democratic elites in the media, in the chattering class, would like Gavin Newsom to get up there, but how you leapfrog Kamala Harris while maintaining black support, again, I don't think that that's a needle that can be thread here. So I think they're really stuck with Joe Biden, which is great news for Republicans.
It is great news indeed, especially when you're looking at only 23% of the country saying that the US is heading in the right direction. The polling on that is, again, remarkable. Now, you mentioned former US President Barack Obama there. He's weighed in on the conflict between Israel and Hamas. The man who enriched and emboldened Hamas's biggest backers, Iran, thinks we're all complicit in what's happening now. Let's have a listen.
What Hamas did was horrific, and there's no justification for it. And what is also true is that the occupation and what's happening to Palestinians is unbearable. Nobody's hands are clean. That all of us are complicit to some degree.
Josh, the chutzpah there is weapon grade.
Let me try to translate roughly what you just heard Barack Obama say. A translation of that would be, what Hitler did at Auschwitz and Treblinka was really bad, but, he happened to own a dog, so he's probably not all that bad, right? And he actually probably had some nice quality. And that basically is what Barack Obama just said. The Hamas Holocaust of October 7th, Rita, was the single deadliest day for the Jewish people since the death of Hitler and the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. It is a day that, for Israel, for the Jewish people, frankly, I would argue for the Western world's broader fight against radical Islamic terrorism, it is a day that, to paraphrase FDR, will live in infamy. And to kind of try to both sides this thing, while the blood is still dry, while all the bodies in the kibbutzes near the border with Gaza have literally to this day not yet been fully identified because they were so grossly disfigured, the bones, the shrapnel, while, by the way, well over 200 hostages remain in the subterranean terror tunnels in Gaza, those Hamas-controlled terror tunnels. We think roughly 15 to 20, at least, of those hostages are American citizens. This is a former president of the United States. While there are, 15, 20 American hostages currently being held in the worst American hostage crisis since, as you alluded to, the 1979 Tehran hostage crisis, have a former president get up there and try to both sides this thing, it's nothing short of disgusting. But unfortunately for, Barack Obama, it's par for the course. As you said, this is a man who filled the coffers of the world's #1 leading state sponsor of jihadism. That, of course, is the head of the snake, the Iranian regime. This is someone whose entire Middle East geopolitics was based on undermining our allies, such as Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, and bolstering our enemies, such as Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. It's horrific, horrific stuff. He obviously should know better. I mean, based on, he's a reasonably well-educated man. He should know better. The problem, of course, is that, as Dennis Prager once said, where you have an overabundance of education and you have a whole lot of knowledge, there not necessarily is a lot of corresponding wisdom to match that knowledge.
And you contrast his reign and the current Biden administration. Some would argue this is Obama's third term. You contrast that with the 4 years of Trump, the Abraham Accords, relationships being normalised between Israel and a number of Muslim-majority countries, night and day. Now, before I let you go, Josh, tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian, or you can call them anti-Israeli protesters, gathered in Washington on the weekend. They smeared red paint on the gates of the White House. They tried to scale the walls. They chanted all sorts of slogans. And they also desecrated monuments, covered statues in graffiti. Let's just have a look at the reaction of one man who was there in the aftermath and was understandably sickened by what he saw.
They have raised the Palestinian flag on the grounds of the White House at Lafayette Park. And walk around with me. Look at this. I've never been so outraged. They've raised the Palestinian flag and more graffiti. More graffiti. Look at this. Free Palestine. You see this? Free Palestine. And look at this sign. Look at this sign.
Decolonise Palestine, decolonise the United States, reads the sign. Joshua, tell me about how authorities handle this lawlessness.
Well, real quick, Rita, let's address that sign on its own merits or lack thereof, as the case may be, because it's actually deeply illustrative. The same people that are calling Israel an apartheid state, that are trying to quote unquote free Palestine from the river to the sea, as they say, which is in essence a call for the extermination of the Jews. It's a call for a second Holocaust. The same people that are calling that also want an end to the United States of America. I mean, it really is just two sides of the exact same coin. It's not an accident, of course, that in Tehran, our #1 arch geopolitical foe, they chant death to America and death to Israel. America is the big Satan, Israel the little Satan. If you think that Israel is a colonizing force, ironically, as the case may be, despite the fact that the Jews were, by definition, the first inhabitants, that's why they call it Judea, that's where the word Jew comes from. If you think that America is a colonizing force, you probably think the exact same thing of Israel and vice versa. So everything is up and down. It's all just horrific there. My take when I saw this happen over the weekend, Rita, was, I thought that we just established a precedent earlier this year when it came to Special Counsel Jack Smith's indictments of former President Trump. Isn't this insurrectionary behavior when you're there at the White House, kind of pounding to get in, painting in blood red the gates of the White House there? I'm pretty sure when I was in law school, we learned that equal prosecution across the rule of law was one of the tenets of a just and sound rule of law. What's good for the goose has to be goose for the gander, unless, of course, you're living in a two-tier system of justice. Conservatives have been saying for many years that that is exactly what is happening before our very own eyes. And unfortunately, unless these people are prosecuted the exact same way that all of the January 6th trespassers were prosecuted, and I don't think that's going to happen, Rita, but unless that happens, it's just yet another data point in this very, very long and inglorious litany of data points evincing the two-tier nature of America's current fallen system of justice.